جدا كانت عن المقاصد في العلوم الشرعية وكذلك مقارنة بين الأديان ضمن إطار نهج تطور العلوم الفقهية في سلطنة عمان. الدكتور سيلقي محاضرة لمدة 30 دقيقة باللغة الإنجليزية، ثم ستقوم الأستاذة شمسة بعرض مختصر لهذه المحاضرة. بعد ذلك سيكون الحوار مفتوحا بينكم وبين البروفيسور.
Professor Brian Winner, Professor of History and Director of Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in Islamic Studies and the History of Religion. He's been a visiting professor in Kuwait, Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and other countries in the Middle East and Europe. Some of his publications are Prophets in the Quran, Applying the Canon in Islam, Moses in the Quran and Islamic Exegesis, Mecca and Eden, Ritual, Relics, and Territory in Islam.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'll try to speak slowly. I'm sure that your English is better than my Arabic. And, it's really an honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here in Oman again. I spent 5 months here as a Fulbright scholar with my family a few years ago, and I've been back every year since to talk through lectures organized by the Wizard al-Awqaf. I brought last year a group of students from the Naval Academy to visit Oman, and they really enjoyed that. I've been asked to talk tonight about the role of Orientalism and the dialogue between civilizations. And so I'd like to just briefly talk about 3 main points related to that, and hopefully only give you enough information that will allow you to ask questions and engage in a dialogue with me, rather than to fully and completely try to convince you of anything. Just raise some questions that we can talk about later. The 3 things I'd like to talk about, first of all, is the notion of the clash of civilizations and where that came from and what I think about it. Secondly, what I mean what I think of when I talk about dialogue and what that means. And third, I spend a little bit of time talking about the study of Islam in European and American universities and how that evolved and how it specifically is related to the first 2 points, dialogue and clash of civilizations. As most of you probably know, the notion or the idea of clash of civilization comes from a book by Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington is a political scientist, and he used culture to try to understand how in the future the world would be organized. So after the end of the Cold War, where you had 2 great superpowers facing off against one another, and basically everyone was on one side or the other, except for a few neutral countries that were close enough to the big countries that they could be neutral and still not be involved in the conflict. So Huntington basically argued that there are historical divisions between certain parts of the world, and the way he makes this argument is by saying that these historical divisions are cultural differences, and that when he talks about civilization, he talks about the Chinese civilization, the Western civilization, and in particular Islamic civilization. And what he does effectively is he essentializes, not quite sure what the word in Arabic would be, but he says that what's essential to each of these civilizations is their cultural identity, that what makes Islamic civilization Islamic is Islam, and what makes Chinese civilization. Chinese is the fact that they're Chinese. And he has a little more trouble defining what the Western definition is. I think that many people have taken issue with his definition of conflict, the way in which he's described the conflict as being necessary because of these historical differences. People have called into question the way he's defined the civilizations. Are there only 3 or 4 in the world? Some people have even argued there are multiple Islamic civilizations, not even a single one there. And I think the most effective way of critiquing his theory is by talking about the notion of essentializing in and of itself. That there is nothing essential about Islamic civilization. There's nothing essential about Western civilization. So to argue that there is a Western or an Islamic civilization and there's a single one and it's defined by a single essence, and that all people for all time who lived in that civilization felt the same way or had the same identity, really ignores everything we know about history and everything we know about culture today. So as I'm sure you all know even better than I do, there are all sorts of differences among people everywhere in the world. Language differences and culture differences, and even people who consider themselves, say, Christian or Muslim, have differences among themselves about what they believe and what they practice. So to try to lump all that into one group, I think it really ignores a lot of what we know about human history and human development. Instead of that notion of an essential element defining civilization, I think it's more helpful to look at civilization as a collective project. It's a project that begins maybe 5,000 or even 7,000, 9,000 years ago. The first domestication of agriculture was 10,000 years ago. Domestication of animals around the same time. Maybe we can push it back to 15,000. It's something that human beings have been engaged in for at least 10,000 years. And it's something that we've done together, and we've tried to accomplish and improve ourselves. And we've gone from, if we understand the anthropological record correctly, we've gone from small groups of people trying to protect ourselves from wolves who are trying to hunt us, to becoming people who built communities where there was specialization, where some people could defend the community, others could grow the food, other people could become scholars, to in the ancient Near East where we find the first cities, magnificent cities that sponsored the invention or discovery perhaps of written language, the preservation of knowledge past one generation, the building of science, the observation of the heavens and the earth, and all the things which today are basically just refinements on those original civilizations that were in Babylon, for example, and in Sumeria and the ancient Near East. So I think that if we look at and take a more historical approach, we see instead of there being essential differences that divide civilizations, we find that throughout human history, human beings have worked together to try to define and build a common civilization. Although, at times, of course, that does result in conflict, and we can talk about the reasons why. But I think that the focus is much better placed on the differences and being generated out of people trying to work together. Let me talk a little bit about what I think dialogue means when we talk about the dialogue between or among civilizations. For me, dialogue always has to be between equals. You cannot have a dialogue with someone that you consider to be your inferior. Dialogue, primarily for me, means listening to someone else and trying to learn from someone else. So it's not a dialogue if you go somewhere and you tell someone, you're doing this wrong, and you should do it differently, and our approach is the best, and you should adopt that, and if you do, well, then you'll be better. That doesn't sound like dialogue at all to me. I can tell you just a short story. I don't want to take too much time, because I want to save time for discussion as well. But when I was at the University of Washington before I went to the Naval Academy, the University of Washington received a grant from the United States Department of State to do a collaborative program with 5 institutions in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And they ranged from the Islam University down to the Bukhari Institute, which trains imams and muftis and others throughout Central Asia. And the way we understood the grant as university professors is that we were going to engage in dialogue with the Uzbeks about how they taught religion and Islam in particular, and they were going to engage in dialogue with us and learn from us and how we did it. Unfortunately, what the Department of State seemed to be more interested in was us telling them, this is how, as Westerners, as Americans, we study religion. And we do it in this secular way, we do it in this comparative way. This is the right approach. And if you adopted it, well then, it would lead to a better society in every part. Now, all of that, it may be true that the approach that we had its advantages, there were certain positive things from there, but my interest was actually learning from the Uzbeks. They have at least 1,000, if not 1,500 years of history of studying religion. Whereas Europeans have about 200 or 300 year history of studying religion. So the Uzbeks had 5 times as much history in this experience in doing this. So I think that illustrates a little bit where I'm coming from. The interest in having a dialogue is listening to the other, learning from the other, finding out how alike we are. So when you meet another person and you have a dialogue with that person, what I think you're interested in is not finding out how we're different, what separates us, but what's similar about us. When we talk about traveling and understanding cultures and other peoples, one of the things that I try to talk to my students about is you know that you've understood something when you start to recognize yourself in the people that you're meeting. That you see something that is common between the two of you. And then, once we understand how we're similar, and we're all human beings, then we can start to focus on what makes us distinct. It's obviously, in this room, we dress differently, and that's interesting. It doesn't mean that we're not human. We don't share the same ideas and the same values. It just means that there are distinctions among us. And for me, that the dialogue, what dialogue produces, is the richness of understanding how human beings collectively have all of these interesting differences. If we were just isolated in our one little community, we would only know who we were. And that's not very interesting, I think, because I already think I know who I am. But I only know who I am from the community in which I live. And if I'm a human being, I have to understand who I am as a Chinese, as an Arab, as an Uzbek, as all of that is being human. I just want to add one more thing about dialogue. And I know it's something very important in recent years. People talk about tolerance, tasama, and also pluralism. And I very much like my involvement with the Wazarat al-Awqaf here because of the publication of tasama and their attempt to try to engage in dialogue and create serious scholarship on the issue. I think some people, though, think of tolerance like this, and that is that we're only allowing other people to be different. We still think we're right, but it's okay if other people are wrong and they're different from us. And I don't really think that may be what some people think tolerance is, but I think tolerance, properly understood and fully understood, is a type of pluralism, which means that we accept the other as being us. So the ideas that they have that are different from us are also our own ideas. We have to learn about them and we have to accept them, and that becomes part of who we are. So having said that as a kind of an introduction, let me just spend a little bit of time talking about the study of Islam in Europe and in the United States. And obviously I can't give you the whole history. We could do a semester-long course on this. But let me talk about 2 things. first of all, just to give you a little bit of background, historically, where did it start and what were the first scholars and what were they interested in? And then secondly, what I'd like to argue is that the way in which Islam is studied in the West and Europe is by definition comparative. And so by definition it engages in dialogue. It doesn't always do it well, but the intention and the result is a dialogue between scholars who don't understand about Islam and scholars who do understand about Islam. And of course, the reverse happens as well. These scholars who know a lot about Islam learn more about the scholars who didn't know a lot about Islam when the process started. To where we reach a point today where some of the most profound insights about Islam come from European and American scholars. And that doesn't make them less important. And it doesn't mean that Muslims don't also have profound insights about Islam and the Middle East and other things. But we understand that we're all in this together, trying to share and work with one another. The one problem with Islamic studies today, and it's true in the Middle East and in other Muslim societies as well as in Europe and the United States, which as an aside we should remember there are quite a lot of Muslims in the United States and Europe who are also scholars of Islam and Islamic studies, so I don't mean to suggest that all European and American scholars are non-Muslim when they study Islam, by no means. But the biggest danger is too much specialization, where if you become a scholar of a particular type of discipline, maybe even in an Islamic university, you become a specialist in usul al-fiqh, and really only 3 other people in the world know what you're talking about, because you become so specialized and so expert in that area. And that happens in the United States and Europe too, where you get scholars who study Islamic studies who don't really talk with scholars in other fields because they're so specialized, and they might use references from Arabic or Persian and other languages, and nobody understands what they are. So that's something we try to avoid. The study of Islam originated in Europe and the United States really as a subsection of biblical studies. So as you know, in Europe and in America in particular, the earliest departments of religion were specifically broken off from theological seminaries. So certainly up to 200 or 300 years ago, anywhere in Europe or the United States takes a little longer to get into that, only a couple hundred years. But you could study religion, but when you studied it, you were studying in a school of theology, a seminary, something where you would go and learn to become a minister or a priest as a practitioner. And then about 300 years ago in Europe, some scholars got together and they decided that they wanted to study religion as part of the social sciences, as part of the humanities. They wanted to study it in a comparative way. And I'm tempted to use the word objective, but that has a lot of connotations with it. So let's just say that they wanted to study religion from a secular perspective, from a modern academic secular perspective, as opposed to a religious perspective. And the earliest scholars who did this were scholars who were interested in the Bible. And the reason they were is because most of the scholarship up till that time had been focused on looking at the Bible as a source of theology and church identity and being involved with the doctrinal debates between different churches. And these scholars really wanted to look at the Bible historically. If we went back to the ancient Near East and we looked at other texts that were from that time period, would they show us things that were similar to what we found in the Bible? So as an example, people compare the 10 Commandments of Moses with the Law Code of Hammurabi, or they look at the stories of a flood that occurs in other traditions. And so these were ways in which these scholars they did not use the material to say, oh, look, this proves the Bible is true because it occurs in other places, but they said this is part of human culture and human history, and we can understand the Bible as an example of that. But interestingly enough, one of the places where these early scholars looked to try to find out more about what life was like in the ancient Near East was Arabia. And by Arabia, I mean specifically this part of the world geographically. So two scholars that are very well known that I'll mention. One is a man named Robert Smith, who gave a series of lectures at the end of the 19th century called Lectures on the Religion of the Semitists. He gave these at Cambridge in 1892. And another very famous scholar, a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen. Wellhausen wrote a study which defined, if any of you have ever done critical Bible studies or read about it, you'll know that Bible scholars think that the Bible consists of different sources. It's that different people wrote different parts of it, and then it was collected and edited together later. And he's the one that came up with this idea. There were Deuteronomistic sources and priestly sources, and different ones found in the text. And then he wrote a book. When he was actually asked, he said, well, why don't you write a book about the Old Testament? And he said, well, I think it's far more interesting to look at what the cultural, historical milieu was in which the Old Testament was written. And to do so, he wrote a book about pre-Islamic Arabia. He wanted to understand what it was like from Arabic sources, like Ibn al-Fawdi and Tabari and other sources, to say, what was it like before Islam in Arabia? That must have been, this was their assumption, whether it's correct or not, we can discuss. That must have been what it was like in the ancient Near East. And other scholars like Robertson Smith believed that if they went to Arabia in the 19th century, they would find nomadic people, they would find Bedouin, and that would be the best way that they could understand what ancient Bedouin or nomadic culture must have been like in the ancient world. Now there's obviously some problems with that approach, but the result was that these early scholars of the Bible basically focused all of their attention on Islamic sources and on looking at Arabic material to try to understand the history of the religion. Now what in time happened is that scholars of Islamic studies began to develop on their own. And so eventually, as we have today, not only in the United States and Europe, we have a category called Islamic studies, a discipline, but we actually have sub-disciplines within that, the same way you might at an Islamic university, say in the Middle East or in Indonesia, have a college of Sharia and a college of Tariq and a college of Usul al-Din, or different sub-specializations within that. But the discipline began linked very closely with biblical studies. So part of the point I wanted to make tonight was to talk about how the origins of the study of Islam in the West, in Europe, and the United States was always comparative. There was always an interest in understanding things in a broad comparative context. Let me also, as a way of talking just a little bit more about the history of Islamic studies, mention two things. One is that as Islamic studies developed, it became something that was focused on different specializations. So there are people today who study the Quran in particular, and they might spend a lot of their career doing that. And it's understood today that if you wanted to study the Quran, and you were interested in it, of course you have to learn Arabic, and of course you have to learn a lot about the history of the Prophet Muhammad and early Islamic history. But as well, you would have to learn Hebrew, and you have to learn Aramaic, and you have to understand the Bible. And if you're really interested, you'd also want to try to understand Iranian religions, Zoroastrianism, and other religions of the ancient Near East, because these are all things that were part of the cultural milieu at the time that the Quran was revealed. So scholarship today is very comparative, and that if you're interested in something like the Quran, you have to. So if you wanted to study Islamic law, not only would you need to understand Arabic, Usul al-Fiqh, Furu'a, and Madahib, and all of that, but you also need to understand how is it related to ancient Near Eastern law, and how is it related to Jewish law or Christian law, and how did those things develop in conversation with one another. And then finally, as part of my description of development of Islamic studies, where it resides primarily today in the United States is in what we call departments of history of religion, or religious studies, or comparative religion. And it's very comparative in its outlook, because Islam is taken as an example of religion, the same way we would look at Christianity as an example of religion, or Hinduism as an example of religion. So it's not a place where you would just focus on Islam and try to just understand it and how it was unique, and all of those things are good, but that's more like the seminary model, or the theological study of religion. Whereas the secular, modern, comparative study of religion is one that tries to place what you're studying, like with the dialogue, to understand how it's similar to other things. What's common about the human experience in religion? Do all religions have certain commonalities about them? Is there a way in which religion functions in all societies to create social order and structure? Those are the kind of questions, looking at things like scripture. All religions seem to have some sort of a scripture. And how is that similar or different in different religious traditions? And the last thing I want to say before I just say a couple words in conclusion is that the study of Islam in the United States and Europe really has a theoretical basis that's comparative and engages in dialogue, and a practical basis that's comparative and encourages dialogue. And the theoretical basis is what I've just indicated or mentioned before, and that is that people who study Islam from the perspective of the history of religions start with the assumption that we're looking at human behavior. So it's not particular to one group or one civilization or one religion, but religion is something that all human beings share. And of course they do it and have it differently. And that's what's the interesting part. If it were all the same, it wouldn't be any fun studying it. But you start from the assumption that this is a human activity. This is a human thing that defines us all as human beings. So some of the most influential theorists of religion are interested in looking at how religion is related to the origins of society. Where did society come from? Were the first human beings religious? Some people have asked the question, for example, when animals were first domesticated. Why were animals first domesticated? Because you can't domesticate animals overnight. It takes several generations, maybe 100 years, to domesticate an animal from a wild animal. Well, you certainly wouldn't want to do that if you were just interested in getting easy food. You could just go hunting, and even if it took you a week, it would be less than 100 years to get the animal. So a lot of anthropologists are arguing today that animals were first domesticated for religious purposes, to perform sacrifice of them, which is very interesting. That maybe religion then led to the domestication of animals and plants in early society. The practical way in which the study of Islam engages in dialogue and comparison is that when one wants to study Islam, for example, you could sit in a library somewhere in Chicago and just read a bunch of books, but that wouldn't allow you to see what you need to see to understand it. Today, when we talk to our students, we tell them, well, not only do you need to learn the languages and learn the history and spend time in the library doing the reading of the text, but you need to go and you need to visit other parts of the world. You need to talk to Muslims, of course. If you're studying Islam, you need to talk to Muslims. You need to ask them, what do they think about this? It doesn't mean necessarily that, well, hey, I have to ask somebody, whatever they say, well, that's what I'm going to say, because they're the Muslim and I'm just listening. But it means that you wouldn't be able to write about Islamic law if you weren't reading what Muslim scholars of Islamic law were saying also about Islamic law. The first Encyclopedia of Islam, the first edition, which was prepared just before World War II, the 1930s, not a single Muslim contributed to the Encyclopedia of Islam. We're now in the third edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, and in both the second and third edition, more than half of the editorial board and the contributors are Muslim. Now, they're not all necessarily Arab. Some are are American, European, or even Asian, or so forth. But I think it just demonstrates the way in which scholarship has recognized that this is a dialogue that occurs among everybody, not just one group of people. And even if one was studying ancient material, like medieval Islam or the origins of Islam, it's still necessary to travel to the places where these things happen. You're not in a time machine going back to see the original, but you can see what it was like, what the mountains look like, the climate, and all that stuff is important. And it encourages people to engage in dialogue, encourages people to engage in comparison and understanding with one another, to eat the food, to talk to the people, to live among them, to see what things are like, and to try to understand, I guess by way of conclusion, that we're all human beings. So let me just say a couple of things, just 3 points in conclusion. The one thing is that I guess all of this is based on education. I'm an educator, I feel like I'm a teacher, and that's what I enjoy doing, and I want to try to do it as well as I can. And for me, education means, first of all, learning. And learning means primarily the context. It's not memorizing what's in a book, but it's understanding how people understand that book, where it was produced, who wrote it, and why it was written, and what effect it's had on society, same with ideas or actions or anything else. And secondly, it involves thinking. And for me, the thinking is how to recognize ourselves and others. So when you encounter something that's different, of course, the first thing you think of is, hey, that's different. But what you need to do is to start thinking of how it's similar to you. How are you the same as this thing that you think is different? And then finally, hopefully, we're developing a more inclusive and civilization with less conflict through this process. So as one of the things that I've always held dear inside of me since I wanted to become a teacher was that if you reduce ignorance, you increase cooperation. And that a lot of conflict in the world is basically based on ignorance. And if people understood better that we're all human beings and we're all basically trying to get the same things out of the world, and we're all capable of cooperating with one another, then we're going to reduce that conflict and we're going to create a better world for everybody. So let me go ahead and stop there and let you summarize that.
بحاول أعطيكم فكرة ولو مختصرة فيما جاء في المحاضرة. تكلم المحاضر عن الاستشراق وحوار الحضارات بالتركيز على 3 نقاط وهي نقاط عامة نوعا ما، ولكن لفتح باب النقاش والحوار فيما بيننا. النقطة الأولى عن صدام الحضارات كمفهوم، النقطة الثانية الحوار ومعناه، النقطة الثالثة الدراسات الإسلامية في أوروبا وأمريكا وكيف ارتباطها بصدام الحضارات وحوار الحضارات. طبعا بدأ مفهوم صدام الحضارات مع ظهور كتاب سامويل هانيتون الذي حاول أن يصف كيف العالم سيكون كنظام بعدما حدث في الحربين العالميتين الأولى والثانية، وكيف هي الحيادية دون الدخول في صراعات. قسم العالم إلى عالمين، الشرق والغرب، وتناول الاختلاف والتنوع الثقافي، وركز على الصين وركز على الحضارات الصين والحضارة الإسلامية والغرب الأوروبي والأمريكي، وتكلم عن مفهوم الجوهر. بس أراجع نقاطي. وتكلم عن السياق الثقافي بالشرق وما يميز الصين عن غيرها أو الشرق عن الغرب. ثم تكلم عن مفهوم صدام الحضارات وكيف بدأ الناس يؤولونه، كل واحد كيف فهم المفهوم، كيف بدأ يؤوله بطريقة معينة أو أخرى. فيقول أن أكثر التأويلات كانت من منظور المنظومة الواحدة لا التعدد في الجوهر. فهو يقول أن لا شيء جوهري كجوهر واحد فقط، ولكن تعدد جوهري ضمن منظومة واحدة. فهو يقول أن هناك اختلاف بين الناس، بين الأديان، بين الثقافات، ولكن تجمعهم منظومة واحدة والتي هي تندرج تحت مفهوم الإنسانية. ويقول أيضا أنه من المجدي النظر للحضارة التعددية تجمعها منظومة جوهرية، بمعنى قبول الآخر والتسامح معه، لا بمعنى أن أنا حضارتي أو ثقافتي هي صائبة والآخر خاطئ. ويقول من منظور أنثروبولوجي، إذا درسنا الأنثروبولوجيا سنجد أن هناك يعني الناس كيف تكون مجتمعاتهم ابتعدوا عن الصدامات وانشغلوا ببناء الحضارات والمجتمعات وحمايتها، فمنهم من تخصص الباحث ومنهم من تخصص التعالم ومنهم المربي والمعلم وآخر، كلهم في تخصصه، ولكن الكل اشتغل في منظومة واحدة وهو بناء الحضارات. فمجمل القول أن الكل اشتغل ببناء المعرفة، وما تبع ذلك أن كل حضارة أو كل أمة جاءت للتضيف على سابقتها ما كان تاريخ إنساني غني بالتنوع. فعبر التاريخ الإنساني وتاريخ الحضارات عمل الناس معا لبناء هذه الحضارات، وربما حدثت صراعات لأسباب مختلفة أخذت مقتضياتها من أوضاع معينة في السياق التاريخي. ثم يأتي بالنقطة الثانية ويتكلم عن حوار الحضارات، ويقول الحوار معناه أن أننا نتكلم عن طرفين متكافئين، طرفين سويين، لا بين طرف يحتل مرتبة أعلى وطرف يحتل مرتبة أدنى، فهذا لا يعتبر حوار. ويأتي مثالا على ذلك أنه حين كان في الجامعة وقبل التحاقه بالأكاديمية نظم في الجامعة التي كان بها برنامجا تكامليا مع أوزبكستان في معهد بخارى، في أوزبكستان. ولماذا مع بخارى في هذا المعهد تحديدا؟ لأنهم بدأوا بدراسة تاريخ الأديان قبل الغرب بقرون. ويتكلم أن كيف فهم الأساتذة هذا البرنامج أو هذه المناحة المقدمة أن هناك سيحدث نوع من الحوار والتعارف، إلا أن القسم اتخذه من منظور آخر وهو منظور مقارن، ألا هو التلقين كطرف صائب وطرف خاطئ، أي ما نسميه بالتكافؤ. ويقول أيضا لأن الإنسانية تجمعنا فلما لا نركز على نقاط التشابه بطريقة أعمق من أن نركز على نقاط الاختلاف. فإذا ما ركزنا على نطاق التشابه سنفهم ذواتنا بأمر وسنبدأ في فهم الآخر كذلك. ثم بدأ يتكلم عن التسامح والتعددية وقبول الآخر، وأشار إلى مجلة التسامح اسمها وزارة الأوقاف، وتكلم عن البعثات التي تكون في حول التسامح، فيقول أننا ما زلنا نعتقد أننا صواب والآخر خاطئ، ووجدنا تصحيح ما لدى الآخر، ولكن الأصح أن نؤمن بالتعددية والتسامح وقبول الآخر. ثم تكلمنا عن تاريخ الدراسات الإسلامية في الغرب في نقطتين. أعطى في النقطة الأولى خلفية تاريخية عن طبيعة هذه الدراسات وكيف تطورت، وكيف أن الغرب يدرس الإسلام من منظور مقارن. وفي النقطة الثانية تحديدا عندما يقول المنظور مقارن، بدأت دراسات بدراسة نقاط الاختلاف لا نقاط التشابه. الموضوع طبعا القديم اللي هو أنا صائب والآخر خاطئ، ولكنه انتهى بعد ذلك بالتعرف على الآخر والسعي لنهل المعرفة، وبالتالي وصلنا إلى مرحلة الحوار. يقول أن المشكلة في هذه الدراسات أن معظم الدارسين توجهوا إلى التخصصية، والتخصصية ضغم، مما جعل الأمر جد صعب على الجمهور العام لفهم هذا الدرس وطبيعة المصطلحات التي يستخدمها. وفي بداية إذا نظرنا إلى السياق التاريخي لدراسة الأديان والتي اتخذت المنظور المقارن، سنجدها كانت عبارة عن دراسة للكتب السماوية، ونسميها التوراتية، وهي طبعا العهد القديم والعهد الجديد التوراة والإنجيل. وتاريخها يرجع إلى 200 إلى 300 سنة، وكان أغلب من يدرس هذه التخصصات كي يتخرج يكون إما سياسي أو عالم دين أو رجل دين. رجل دين طبعا مش مفهوم المفهوم. ثم بدأت دراسة الأديان كعلم، بمعنى اتخذت نقل موضوعية ولكن إذا قلنا موضوعية فإننا سندخل في هو تكلم عن الموضوعية في دراسة الأديان كعلم، ولكن فضل استخدام مصطلح الإلحاد، يعني ما نفضل
يعني هذا الحاد
أنا الحيادية طبعا، إذا أنا أدرس موضوع علماني أو ملحد أنا لا أنتمي إلى هذا ولا إلى هذا، حيادي، ولكن استخدم المعنى. أنا هذا بستخدم المعنى في كثير أسئلة.
ربما هي نظرة أن يعني ليس هناك فاضل بين الأديان مرة واحدة، ما هو الحال ولا؟
هو ما
استخدمه كالعلمانية.
نعم،
سيكولاريزم
علمانية أو دنيوية.
الاتفاق الآن مصطلحين علمانية.
طيب علمانية ولا ذلك؟
بمعنى ما يكون منتميا في الدراسة ولا أي جهة مستقلا.
هذه هو أهم شيء نوصل للمعنى بعيد عن المصطلحات. فبدأوا يدرسون الكتب المقدسة وعلاقتها بالسياق التاريخي أو التاريخي، ومدى الارتباط الموافق بين ما جاء في الكتب السماوية والسياق التاريخي كما وضع بعض المؤرخين. فيقول أن هناك عالم ألماني أو دارس ألماني فون الذي درس الكتب السماوية المقدسة وتحدث عنها أنها جاءت من مصادر مختلفة وجمعت لاحقا. فطلب منه أن يكتب أو أن يشتغل بدراسة كيف كتب يكتب كتاب حول العهد القديم اللي هو التوراة أو كيف كتبت، ولكنه ارتأى أن يكتب كيف كانت الحياة قبل الإسلام، قبل دخول الإسلام. أما روبرت أنسلر حاول دراسة القرن التاسع عشر وتحديدا في المنطقة العربية، لأنه رأى أنه سيوجد مجتمعات البدو في المنطقة العربية، وبالتالي سيستطيع بمعنى من منظور أو آخر فهم العالم القديم ancient world. ولكنه انتهى بالتركيز على مراجع إسلامية وعربية فقط. وفي نفس الحين ووقت دراسته حين اعتمد على المصادر العربية كان العرب أو الدارسين المسلمين قد اشتغلوا أيضا بتطوير علومهم من علم الأديان لديهم، فكانت هناك الكثير من المعاهد المتخصصة كالمعهد المتخصص في إندونيسيا. فيقول مجمل القول أن بدأت دراسات الأديان أو دراسة الكتب السماوية المقدسة بالتركيز على دراسة أول شيء الكتب السماوية المقدسة ثم دراسة الإسلام من منظور مقارن مع هذه الكتب هي التوراة والإنجيل، ثم تناولت تاريخ الدراسات الإسلامية وكيف تطورت حتى أصبحت تركز على تخصصات مختلفة. وحين جاءوا مثلا على دراسة القرآن أو أصول الحضارة الإسلامية ووقت ظهور الإسلام، رأوا أنهم عليهم أن يدرسون كذلك اللغة الآرامية والعربية والفارسية والكتب المقدسة التي سبقت الإسلام، فكانت تتطلب الكثير على دارس الإسلام والسياق الذي جاء، لأن الإسلام كان متأثر طبعاً بالحضارات المجاورة، كونه كان في القلب بين الآرامية الفارسية العربية كلها. فيقول أن الدراسات الإسلامية في الغرب أخذت منظورين، منظور مقارن بالأساس ولكن جانبين، الجانب العملي والنظري. إذا نظرنا إلى الجانب النظري سنجده يتركز على السياق التاريخي في دراسة السلوك الإنساني والممارسات الإنسانية وارتباط الدين بالمجتمع وبداية الإنسانية، وهل كان الناس عند بداية الإنسانية مؤمنين مش بمعنى مسلمين ولكن يؤمنوا إيمان معين، وكيف تطور البشر. أما الجانب العملي، أما في الشق العملي فيقول أن دراسة الإسلام لا تكون بالقراءة فقط، فلا يمكن لدارس الدين الإسلامي أن يكتب شيئا عن الإسلام بالقراءة فقط، ولكن في الزيارات الميدانية والتحاور مع أهل الدين أو المسلمين أنفسهم، فلا تستطيع الكتابة وحدها ذلك، والتركيز على نقاط التشابه لا الاختلاف. فيقول مثلا عندما ظهرت أول موسوعة عن الإسلام لم يساهم فيها أي مسلم في طبعته الأولى، بينما حين خرجت الطبعة الثالثة ساهم فيها عدد كبير من المسلمين. ويقول فهم الإسلام يأتي فهما في الترحال وزيارة هذه الأماكن والتعرف إلى الناس والطقس والبيئة وأسلوب الحياة، وفهم أن مفهوم الإنسانية هي ما يجمع البشر بشكل عام. وكل ما قاله يندرج تحت منظومة التعليم، والتعليم يعني التعلم وفهم السياق الذي جاء فيه العلم، ويتطور مفهوم الحضارة بالابتعاد عن معاني الصدام والتقارب مع معاني ومفاهيم التشابه في معطياتها. أتمنى أكون
هو كاتب في ولاية التسامح. ولاية التسامح له أوقاف وشؤون دينية كل 3 أشهر. ابتداء الحوار مفتوح. طبعا الذي يرغب أن يسأل باللغة العربية البروفيسور يعرف اللغة العربية، والذي يريد أن يسأل باللغة الإنجليزية يسأل، ولكن ليعطي المستمعين الآخرين طريقة بسيطة جدا. وأكيد يفضل
Thank you, Professor, very much for this elaborated. My name is Kais. I'm from Polish. Thank you very much for this elaborated brief lecture. And actually, I have many points, but I would stick to 2 points to give others a chance to ask. We argue in the Arab world that the major problem that we have with the West in general, that they are judging us based on the misdoings of some of us, especially the extremes, and not based on Islam itself. So they don't study Islam well, or they don't know Islam well. That's why they misjudge us. I want to actually to give us your idea of this argument, and then can we make things easier or less complicated with regard to dialogue between culture or between religions, by restricting ourselves to some points. First, this is my idea, that we have to accept the other first in order to start the dialogue. Then we have to agree that we are different, and we should appreciate this fact that we are different, because we need to learn and to know each other and about each other. Then the goal should be not to convert some of us, to other religions, but to live together. So the goal should be coexistence. And I think with regard to all religions, we have the methods to make us actually live in peace, because we have the common values that make us, live in peace together. Thank you very much.
هو يبغى يسمع كل الكلام يعني بعدين؟
شخصين.
يفضل يتكلم يرد على الآخر من أن يسمع. تفضل أن تسمع ولا أن ترد عليه؟
To answer me first and then to ask me or whatever you want.
لا. ما أعرف. تفهم العربية الآن لو كلمت بالعربية؟ فلا ما أحتاج.
تتكلم بالعربية الفصحى.
إيه ماشي بس. طيب أولا نشكر وصولك إلى عمان، هذا هو الأمر، وأهلا وسهلا بك في عمان. اسمي عبد الحميد، أعمل في شركة تنمية مشروع عمان الفيديو. حقيقة أنت ذكرت في بعض ما ذكرت ذكرت الدراسة الشمولية، الدراسة العامة الشاملة التي ينبغي أن تكون الدراسة الشاملة التي تدرس الأديان على أساس إنساني، بمعنى أنها ما تختص بالإسلام ولا بالنصرانية ولا باليهودية ولا بالبوذية، إنما تدرس كما قلت أنت تدرس الأديان دراسة عامة شاملة بين قوسين إلحادية أساس يكون مع نفسه. السؤال الآن ماذا وجدت من هذه الدراسة أو ماذا وجد الإخوان من الدراسة الشمولية؟ إيش الأشياء القصص؟ هل هي قصة موسى عليه السلام مثلا؟ هل هي ألواح موسى أو أنها قصة نوح فيضان نوح وما إلى ذلك؟ لو ممكن لو سمحت أن تطلعنا على بعضها يكون جيدا. السؤال الثاني هو متعلق بسؤال الأخ العزيز. أنتم كمثقفين كأناس مختصين في أمريكا في خلال السنوات الثماني الماضية وخاصة السنوات الأخيرة من عمر السيد بوش رئيس أمريكا عندما كان يلوح بصدام الحضارات وذكرها عدة مرات، هل كانت عندكم أنشطة حتى تحجوا من غضب أو من أثر الساسة الأمريكان في ذيك الفترة، أم اكتفيتم بالصمت وتدريس فقط طلبتكم في الجامعة؟ I hope you do understand me.
I didn't understand all of the last question.
Indeed, it is about okay. I can say it in English instead because they would understand.
يكفي فهمك.
هو يقول ما فهم آخر شيء.
ترجمونه مختصر.
Okay, the last 4 years, so I'll concentrate on this. The last 4 years of the presidency of Bush. I mean, what have you done as doctors who know Islam and who have studied Islam independently?
Yeah.
شكرا.
Let me answer your last question and your first comment, as I think that they're similar. And let me start by saying that you're absolutely right that not only in the United States do we judge Muslims by the actions of a few people, but other people, for example, Arabs in the Middle East tend to judge Americans by the actions of Bush, which of course most Americans don't agree with. So there's every side has its stereotypes and what's easy, what you hear the most and what's easy to explain. And hopefully, inshallah, we're moving into a different era now with the new president, and we have some different ideas coming forth. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens there. And I think both of you asked about scholarship, particularly in the United States. And one of the problems I've encountered since traveling, I've been traveling in the Middle East for more than 20 years. Since the past 8 years, I've encountered people who don't understand the difference between discourse that comes out of America about Muslims and then scholarship by Americans who are specialists in Islamic studies. So if someone, like Jerry Falwell says something about Islam, he's not a scholar of Islamic studies. And if someone who's a part of the Bush administration says something about Islam, that person is not a scholar of Islamic studies. So to judge American scholars of Islam by those statements would be wrong, because those people don't know what they're talking about. And usually they don't care because they're trying to promote their own perspective. And as regards to the last part of your question, there have been very serious and concentrated efforts by scholars of Islam in the United States to try to make changes in the way that our previous administration had viewed Muslims and the Middle East. Sometimes those were very successful, and sometimes they were not. And I don't want to go into details because I don't like even scholarly politics, but there were some scholars whom the previous American administration consulted about Islam in the Middle East that gave what I think were very ignorant and very wrong ideas that actually influenced policies, many of which, however, I think changed before the end of the Bush administration. And we don't, again, I don't need to go into detail, but I'm sure that some of you know that certain ways that the American military acted in Iraq at the beginning of the invasion and occupation of Iraq were very different from the way that they're acting in Iraq today. And so some of that was learned the hard way, so to speak. And maybe those will be positive lessons that can help America grow and learn from the mistakes it's made. I think you also asked about the history of religions and why comparing them and what the goal of that.
Yeah, I mean, what is the common? What
Yes.
are the common, for example, histories or the common
Yes.
factors that you can?
And you mentioned some of the stories of the prophets, which happens to be something I'm very interested in myself. As was mentioned in my introduction, I wrote a book on Musa, on Moses, and I looked particularly at the story in the Quran, Surah Kahf, and I compared that with the stuff from Jewish and Christian sources to try to figure out. There's an anthropologist named Claude Strauss, who's very well known for his work in myth. And I don't mean myth to mean that it's not true, but myth means stories that people tell about themselves and help to shape their identity. And I believe after reading his material that in order to understand fully any one story, you have to read all the different versions of it from all the different cultures. So a really good example of that is the Joseph story, the Surah Yusuf in the Quran, which is of course unique. The only whole surah that's completely a story about one person and he's never mentioned anywhere else in the Quran. That story actually goes back to ancient Egypt. We have Egyptian versions of it. It was discussed widely in Spain in the Middle Ages. Of course, it's in the Bible. And to read all of those different stories, you see all the connections which you ordinarily wouldn't see. Just as an example, in the Quran, of course, is the mention of the episode where the women cut themselves with the knives. And that's not in the biblical account. But it is in Jewish and Christian versions that are not in the Bible. And so it was really interesting to figure out where did that come from and who was talking about what and what did it mean. And it doesn't in no way lessens the idea that the Quran is revealed. It in fact builds upon that idea that if God was revealing the Quran to people in a language and concepts that they would understand, then presumably he would want them to understand what the story was about and understand all the detail of it and how it would impact other people. So I think it's for me it's fascinating to look at the stories. And I think there's other things one can look at as well. I mentioned some of them: worship, and ibadat, scripture, and things that are similar in different traditions. And ultimately, the goal is to get back to what is common about human beings in their religious practices and their ideas. What binds us together? What do we do that's in common?
حول سؤال كيف البعض يحكم على الإسلام من خلال ما تقوم به مجموعة صغيرة؟ يرد على ذلك أن أيضا في العالم الإسلامي وفي الشرق يحكمون على الشعب من خلال الحكومة أو السياسة. مثلا إذا نظرنا إلى سياسة بوش نجد أن الكثيرين ينظرون نظرة سلبية للشعب من خلال سياسة الدولة أو الحكومة. بالنسبة المستشار يتكلم أن هناك بالنسبة له هناك فصل بين الدراسة وبين السياسة، إلا أنه لا ينفي تداخل الحقلين. فمثلا في سياسة بعض الحكام كانوا يستشيرون بعض الدارسين حول الإسلام والمسلمين، وكانت استشاراتهم في كثير من الأحيان غير صائبة، مما أثر سلبا على سياسة البلد في اتخاذ سياسات معينة. فإذا ما نظرنا إلى ما قامت به السياسة الأمريكية في العراق مثلا، هو متفائل جدا في السياسة الجديدة ورؤيتها، ويقول علينا أن نتعلم من الأخطاء التي اقترفناها. ونقول وحول السؤال عن الشمولية في دراسة الأديان، يقول أن هناك قصص تجمع قصص نجدها مثل قصص سيدنا موسى وسيدنا يوسف موجودة في التوراة في الإنجيل في القرآن، إلا أن السرد يختلف في نقاط معينة. فمثلا إذا نظرنا إلى قصص سيدنا يوسف نجد أن هناك ما يتعلق بقطع النساء أيديهن أو جرحها غير موجود في النص التوراتي. فيقول التركيز أكثر على نقاط التشابه بين الأديان من خلال النظر في العبادات والممارسات وما يجمع الناس. هذا بشكل عام.
Regarding the last point about misconceptions of Muslims in the West and how they think about us, I think the question that we should ask is not what the Western scholars have done, but we should ask what Muslims themselves have done in this regard. I mean, what did we do as Arabs, as Muslims, in changing this misconception? Okay, after the developments of the prophets, okay, we launched, let's say, a TV channel, which is Al-Zad, and it's all in Arabic, and it's all its programs are in Arabic, okay, and who is listening to this channel? It's Arabs, it's Muslims. We should actually, what I think, that we should change this misperception. We should react, we should act, instead of waiting the others to change or to let's say, as you say, they give consultations. When they were consulted, they gave, as you said, bad, or let's say, don't say bad, at least what they did. Okay, this is my point. Thank you.
I have some comments. The first item is, in your discourse, I think you ignored the side that you established the first notion about, or the first concept about Orientalism. Edward Said, in his great book, Orientalism, Knowledge, Power, and Discourse, was talking about Orientalism as Orientalism is a type of thought that focuses on ontological and epistemological discrimination between East and West. I think the whole discourse was derived or was presented from the religious viewpoint. But we have another or a different viewpoint, I mean the culture. In this context, I have one question. What is, from today's, we call our era, our contemporary era, as the post-colonial era, especially in cultural studies. In this context, what is the role of culture in the
the post-colonial era, enrichment, the civilization of life.
عادة سأسأل سؤالي باللغة العربية يعني سأحاول أن أتأنى قليلا. طيب دكتور ويلر، أنت تزور السلطنة للمرة الثانية ربما، وأتصور أن هذا الأمر سيسمح لي بأن أتحدث معك بقدر من الصراحة والوضوح. بعد 11 سبتمبر كان هناك حديث عن نشاط في دوائر الاستشراق الأمريكية على وجه الخصوص، ربما لفهم الظاهرة المتفكرة حينها للإسلام السلفي بين قوسين الجهادي. هذا النشاط الاستشراقي الذي كانت تشير إليه عليه بعض الدلائل استقبل في الأوساط الإسلامية والعربية بقدر من الريبة. يعني كان هناك تساؤل: ها نحن نتحول من أمة ينبغي أن تبنى معها الجسور إلى موضوع ربما موضوع أمني على وجه الخصوص. ما ضاعف من هذا الفهم أن سمعة الاستشراق في الأوساط الشعبية وليست في الأوساط الأكاديمية ليست سمعة جيدة في الأوساط الشعبية على الأقل، لكن ربما في الأوساط الأكاديمية ليس هناك تعميم تجاه الظاهرة الاستشراقية، هناك قدر من وضع المستويات، من تحديد مستويات للتعامل. لكن مما ضاعف من دعني أقول من سوء الظن بالنشاط الاستشراقي بعد 11 سبتمبر أن بعض الجهات الاستشراقية كانت مسؤولة دون شك عن أحداث هائلة هزت العالم، وأهمها حرب العراق. من المعروف أن البروفيسور برنارد لويس يتحمل مسؤولية في التنظير للحرب على العراق. أريد أن أسمع منك تعليقا حول النشاط الاستشراقي في دوائر الاستشراق الأمريكية خلال هذه ال8 سنوات من حكم الرئيس بوش منذ 11 سبتمبر إلى الآن. فيما كانت تشتغل؟ على ما كانت تشتغل؟ كيف تنظر إلى هذه الأمة؟ هل هي أمة أم هي موضوع للتحليل والفهم؟ المسألة الأخرى، هل، وهذا سؤال يرتبط بسؤال أخي عبد الحميد، هل النشاط الاستشراقي الأمريكي على وجه الخصوص والغربي عموما مقدم الآن على تحول في التوجه إلى تغيير الوجهة وتعامل من نوع جديد؟ نحن نرى الآن يعني ملامح مرحلة مختلفة، هذا ما نأمله في أمريكا. هل يعني هذه الجدلية، إذا سمحت لي باستخدام هذا التعبير، بين الاستشراق والسياسة، من منهما يؤثر في الآخر؟ هل الآن سنشهد أن الدوائر الاستشراقية ستغير مجرى اهتمامها وتعاملها مع الحالة الإسلامية بعد ظهور نجم الرئيس الجديد؟ شكرا جزيلا.
سأختصر بعد هذا التطويل الذي سمعناه والكلام الجميل. سأختصر. تشرفت بمقابلتك أول مرة عندما حضرت العمان، وأتشرف بمقابلتك هذه المرة. ربما لا تذكرني، أنا اسمي علي عبد الله ومحامي. سأحدثك حديثا مختصرا كنت حدثتك فيه من قبل، وأرجو أن تعيه، وأرجو أن أرى رد فعلك من أول ما رأيتك منذ عامين تقريبا إلى الآن. حديثي الذي حدثتك فيه أنا أجد من الصعوبة بمكان أن نتكلم عن الاستشراق أو عن حوار الحضارات نحن كمسلمين، ونحن أمام صراع حضاري في توضيح وتبيان وتبليغ رسالتنا الأزلية الكونية للعالم. نحن أصحاب رسالة محبة وسلام كما قال الأخ، ولكن أسانا توصيلها. الحديث الذي سأحدث إياه باختصار هو أننا نحن كمسلمون لم نفهم ديننا بعد. We yet didn't understand our religion so far. بمعنى أن دفة القرآن التي بين يدينا إنما هي تحمل كتابين في كتاب واحد. كتاب واحد، وهذا هو الآن الحديث المختصر الذي أرجو أن تعيه جيدا وأن يكون محور لاستعادته في حوار وفي دراسة داخلية أو مع الآخرين أو في التعمق في دراسة الإسلام. إن الإسلام كتاب القرآن هو كتابان في كتاب واحد. الكتاب الأول في معظمه حتى وإن تفرقت الآيات يحمل مضمون علماني. الإسلام في جوهره رسالة علمانية. الإسلام في جوهره رسالة علمانية. هذا ما لم نفهمه نحن المسلمون، ولهذا السبب نحن لا نقبل لا بالآخر ولا نقبل بأنفسنا. نحن نتصارع. نحن ليست لدينا مشكلة مع بوش أو أوباما. هذا عرض سياسي. مشكلتنا حضارية أزلية. كيف نفهم أنفسنا وكيف نوصل هذا الفهم إلى الآخر، إن كنتم أنتم أو صينيون أو هنود أو غيرهم. هذه الرسالة الأزلية. الدفة الأخرى من القرآن هي الرسالة العلمانية التي عندما تطلق كلمة علمانية فإن أي مسلم يضع يده على الخنجر كما رأينا هنا، لأنهم يحذرون من هذه الكلمة بالرغم من الإسلام في جوهره ورسالته العالمية التي سوف تهيمن على الإنسانية جميعا، ولن نقبل من الآخر دينا إلا الإسلام. إنما هو في هذا الجانب العلماني الذي هو يحمي حرية المعتقد، والذي هو يقول بالعدل وبالمساواة وبالأخوة. هذه الهيمنة التي سوف. أما إذا رأينا الدفة الأخرى فهي الدفة التفصيلية التي انبنى عليها المذاهب الإسلامية، التي هي الآن الصراع الداخلي بين المسلمون، بحيث لا يقبلون بالآخر ولا يقبلون بأنفسهم. لا الشيعة يقبل بالسني ولا السني يقبل بالآخر ولا الضال يقبل بهذا، ونحن كل دولة افتقرنا دولة دينها الإسلامي وأن مذهبها هو هكذا. شمال أفريقيا مالكي لا يقبل بمذاهب أخرى. الشيعة لا يقبلون بالمذاهب الأخرى. هذا مشكلتنا نحن التي يجب أن نحلها حتى نستطيع أن نوصل لحل مشكلة الآخر. الإنسانية بحاجة للإسلام بس في جوهره العلماني، وهذا ليس كلام الحاد الذي يتخوفون عنه. هذا كلام عمق الدين، وجوهر الدين هو الرسالة العلمانية. أرجو أن تفهم في أن تركز عليه. عندما الفقه انبنى كله على الجزء الثاني من الكتاب في دفة القرآن اللي هو الذي انبنى عليه الفقه، التفاصيل، الأشياء العرضية، ولم ينبني على رسالته الأساسية التي هي سوف تهيمن على العالم. والواقع أن الإسلام مطبق. أنتم مسلمون، الأوروبيون مسلمون، اليابانيون مسلمون، فيما يتعلق بعلمانيتهم التي تحترم الآخر وتحمي حقه في العبادة. وهكذا فعل الصحابة، وهكذا فعل الرسول، وهكذا فعل العلماء الذين يقدرون الدين ويفهمونه معرفة حقيقية. عندما لا نفهم الدفة هذه الأخرى، الدفة الحقيقية علمانية الإسلام، فإننا نركز على الجانب الآخر الذي يؤدي إلى الصراع بيننا نحن بعض وبيننا وبين الآخر. سوف نتكلم عن بوش، سوف نتكلم عنها. هذا عرض، هذا زوال. غزو العراق سيزول، امريكا ستزول، نحن سنزول، انما الاسلام سيبقى في رسالته العلمانيه التي الان موجوده في العالم. شكرا. انا اسف.
في ازاله الشك عند كثير من الناس حول الاستشراق ودوره في حوار الحضارات، وكيف نزيل كثير من التساؤلات وعلامات الاستفهام حول هذا الموضوع.
Of course, this is the dialogue we're talking about. We need to learn from one another. And if I could just sit and listen to each one of you, that would be what I'd like to do, rather than talk myself. But I would like to just respond to a couple of points there. You brought up the name Bernard Lewis. I didn't say it, but that's who I was thinking of course. And just so you know, another person who exactly said the same thing as Wahwar. So it's not limited just to Americans or non-Arabs. Arabs were advising the old administration exactly the same way that Bernard Lewis was. So it was, and as you said, and reminded me that I had said that it was very unhelpful points that they brought up, and I think that perhaps we should focus on that. That doesn't seem to be the direction that even the Bush administration was moving in the end. They seem to have learned something from the mistakes, and I think we could talk a lot about whether it was a good idea that the United States invaded Iraq and occupied it, killed 100,000 people, and all of these terrible things. But one thing that I think is positive in the face of these terrible tragedies is that the United States does seem to learn from its mistakes. And it doesn't mean it won't repeat them, but hopefully it's learning something in this case. I don't know yet. And I'm not trying to defend the United States at all. I'm trying to talk as a scholar. And I acknowledge that I didn't talk about Edward Said, and I think the relationship between certain scholars like Fuad Ajami and Bernard Lewis with the U.S. administration is an excellent example of the worst kind of Orientalism that Edward Said is describing. The use of knowledge in the pursuit of power. And, whether for better or worse, it's not possible to pursue knowledge without linking it with power. It's always true. Even the early Arab conquests of the Near East, the early invasions, the Arabs who left the Arabian Peninsula felt the same way when they encountered the Persians and the Syrians and the Armenians. And Islam was very much an Arab religion at the beginning until it broadened out and included other groups within that religion. So everything goes through these things. It's not always a good idea, though, to take upon yourself an imperialistic role in the world, because when you do that, you're going to encounter problems like this. It's to be expected. So I think Edward Said's work is obviously very, very difficult. It has many, many problems, but he is absolutely right that we need to start thinking about these issues. And maybe the final thing I can say is, you asked about post-colonialism and the role of culture, and that's what I'm trying to think through myself. And we could refer to people like Homi Bhabha and other theorists today, but yes, of course. There are many, many excellent theorists out there. I'm a little more simple-minded. I try to reduce what they're saying to something I can understand. And I don't understand most of what they're saying, but I think the role of culture and learning about ourselves in the different forms we take around the world and historically is to create better understanding and to enrich ourselves. So it's not a matter of saying, it's not a matter of having dialogue and at the end knowing I'm different from you. But it's a matter of having a dialogue at the end and saying, I've changed now because I've learned something that I didn't know about myself from you. And so I'm better for having that dialogue. And so in the end, we all change every time we have the dialogue. It would be terrible if we just went home and reified how we were different from everyone we just talked to, because that wouldn't be very helpful. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure and honor.
It is a short time, very short time.
أول بتناول الأسئلة بعدين الإجابة. في أول شيء الطرح الأول كان عن أو التعليق الأول كان عن المفاهيم المغلوطة عن المسلمين لدى الغرب وما دور الدارسين، ولكن الأجدر بنا أن نسائل أنفسنا ما دور المسلمين أنفسهم لقاء ظهور مثل هذه المفاهيم المغلوطة. ثم يتم حديثه ويتكلم عن ظهور قناة الرسالة والتي هي بالعربية فما جدوى ظهورها. فيقول أخيرا أن يجب أن نبادر لا انتظار مبادرة الآخر. ثم يشير آخرا في تعليقه لأعمال إدوارد سعيد وتناوله لمفهوم الاستشراق، ثم بعد ذلك يعرج على عصر ما بعد الحرب وارتباط ذلك بحوار الحضارات. والسؤال الذي بعد ذلك كان عن زيارة البروفيسور برانن ويلر الثانية للسلطنة، وبالتالي ما يتيح قدر أكبر من الصراحة والوضوح في التحدث عن أحداث ما بعد 11 سبتمبر.
ممكن تتجاوزي السؤال بتاع العربي، تتجاوزي السؤال تلوحين إليه وتتجاوزي.
طيب هو تطرق بس عشان النقطة برجع لها لبرنارد لويس وكيف أنه ساهم في رسم صورة سلبية.
المصائب.
ما بعد الاستعمار. وأخيرا هناك كان تعليق عن أننا كمسلمين أصحاب رسالة محبة وسلام، ولكننا أسأنا إيصالها للآخر لأننا لم نفهم ديننا بالقدر الكافي، وأن الإسلام في جوهره رسالة علمانية، ولكننا لم نفهم ذلك فلم نقبل الآخر ولم نحترم حرية المعتقد، وفي شقها الثاني هو فقهي. التعليق الأخير كان عن دور الدارس في الغرب في إزالة الصورة النمطية السلبية عن أو حول الاستشراق. ويرد البروفيسور برانن ويلرز أنه أحرى بنا أن نركز على جوانب أخرى وليس على الجوانب السلبية. فمثلا يشير إلى إدوارد سعيد وكتاباته وكيف أنه حاول أن يضع مفهوم الاستشراق، وأنه تناول أيضا إذا كنا نقول أن برنارد لويس روج لشيء ما، وهناك أيضا فؤاد لاريني الذي روج لشيء مشابه، بما معناه أنه وظف أو استخدم المعرفة في الاستحواذ والسلطة والقوة، أي معنى الإمبريالية بمفهوم عام. ويقول عن ما حدث في العراق أننا لنرى الجانب الإيجابي فيه، كأن كيف لنا أن نتعلم من الأخطاء التي حدثت والتي نأمل عدم تكرارها، وأني لا أدافع هنا عن سياسة أو أخرى، ولكنني أتحدث من منظور دارس للوضع. أما ما بعد الاستعمار
والله دكتور ويلر، يعني هذا الدرس كلفنا كثيرا، كلفنا وكلفكم الكثير. هل انتهيت؟
لا، جزئية أخيرة. أما إذا تكلمنا عن المنظرين الذين نظروا لفترة ما بعد الاستعمار أو ما بعد الكولونيالية، يقول أنه يحاول فهم ما يقولون مع صعوبته، ولكنه يفهم أنهم في محاولات لخلق فضاء أرحب للتفاهم والتحاور الذي يصلنا في المرحلة الأخيرة، أو نأمل أن نصل لهذه المرحلة وهي التغيير للأفضل.
كنت أريد أن أقول قبل أن تأخذ جابر، الجانب الإيجابي في قضية العراق وغيرها من الكوارث التي حلت بنا وبكم. يعني إن كنا ننظر إلى الناحية الإيجابية فسنبسط الموضوع كثيرا. يعني هذا الدرس الذي ترى فيه جانب إيجابي كلفنا وكلفكم الكثير، كلف أمتنا أكثر من 300,000 قتيل، وكلفكم ربما 4,000 قتيل من جنودكم. هل كنا في حاجة لماذا لا نستفيد من دروس التاريخ لماذا لا نستفيد من وقائع الماضي؟ لماذا نحتاج دائما أن نعيد اختراع العجلة من جديد كلما أردنا أن نكتشف قانونا ما؟ القانون مستقر، الناموس، هذا الناموس مستقر ومضطرد ومتوالي، لا حاجة في كل مناسبة لأن نعيد التجربة من جديد حتى نخرج بالخلاصات والنتائج. كانت النتيجة واضحة منذ البداية قبل أن نقدم على هذا التخريب والدمار للإنسان وللبشر وللحياة وللكون وللعلاقات بين الأمم والشعوب. لم نكن في حاجة إلى هذا الدرس في نظري يا دكتور.
شكرا أستاذ. نشكر الدكتور بروفيسور براون بولاك على هذه الدقائق التي منحنا إياها. شكرا لحضوركم. نشكر كذلك أسرة الترجمة